curse is broken. June 4th, 2025 will be remembered as the night Edmonton Oilers fans finally exhaled. 4-7 straight playoff series. Dating back to 2020, the Oilers had developed the most frustrating habit in hockey. They could not win a game one. Not against weak teams, not against strong teams, not at home, not on the road. The pattern had become so predictable that fans would joke about it on social media before each series even started. The streak began innocently enough in 2020 when Edmonton lost 6-4 to Chicago in what was called a qualifying round. Most fans shrugged it off as bad luck. Then it happened again in 2021 against Winnipeg. By 2022, when they lost Game 1 to Los Angeles, people started to notice. When they lost Game 1 to Los Angeles again in 2023, the pattern became undeniable. The 2024 playoffs made it worse as Edmonton dropped Game 1 3 separate times on their run to the Stanley Cup Final. What made this streak so painful was not just the losses themselves, but what they represented. Edmonton had Connor McDavid, the best player in the world. They had Leon Draisaitl, one of the most dangerous scorers in hockey. They had built a team specifically designed to win the Stanley Cup. Yet every single playoff run started the same way, with disappointment and the sinking feeling that maybe this group just could not get over the finish line. The numbers told a brutal story. Teams that win Game 1 of a playoff series go on to win that series about 60% of the time. For Edmonton, starting every series down 1-0 meant they were constantly playing catch-up hockey. They had to be perfect in the games that followed, with no room for error. The psychological weight of always falling behind first was enormous for both players and fans. By the time the 2025 Stanley Cup Final arrived, Edmonton's Game 1 problem had become one of the biggest storylines in hockey. Sports analysts debated the reasons behind it. Fans created memes about it. Opposition teams seemed to expect it. The curse had taken on a life of its own, becoming as much a part of Edmonton's identity as their blue and orange jerseys. Then came June 4th, 2025, Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final against Florida. The same familiar feeling crept into Rogers' Place as the game progressed. Florida took an early lead. Edmonton fought back to tie it, but regulation ended 3-3. Overtime began with the weight of 7 consecutive Game 1 failures hanging over every shift. Leon Draisaitl had already scored twice in the game, dragging his team back from deficit that felt all too familiar. At 6 minutes and 30 seconds into overtime, Draisaitl found himself alone in front of the Florida net. The puck came to him clean, and he buried it past Sergei Bobrovsky. The goal was simple, almost routine for a player of his caliber. But the reaction was anything but routine. Rogers' Place exploded with a sound that seemed to release years of pent-up frustration. Players piled on top of each other as if they had won the Stanley Cup itself. Fans hugged strangers and wiped away tears. The Edmonton Oilers had finally won a Game 1. After 7 tries, after countless hours of analysis and soul-searching, after becoming a punchline in hockey circles, they had broken through. The curse that had defined their recent playoff history was officially dead. But to understand why this moment was so significant and why it took so long to happen, we need to examine exactly what went wrong all those times before. The statistical nightmare. The numbers behind Edmonton's Game 1 struggles tell a story that goes beyond simple bad luck. When you look at 7 consecutive defeats spread across 5 years, patterns emerge that reveal deeper problems with how this team approached the most important games of each series. The streak began in August 2020 during the COVID-19 bubble playoffs. Edmonton faced Chicago in what the NHL called a qualifying round, essentially a playing game to make the real playoffs. The Oilers lost 6-4 in a game that saw them give up 4 goals in the third period. It was disappointing, but Chicago was a veteran team with championship experience. Most people wrote it off as growing pain for a young Edmonton core. 1 year later, Edmonton opened their 2021 playoff series against Winnipeg with another Game 1 loss. This time it was a 4-1 defeat that saw the Oilers struggle to generate offense against a Jets team that had finished lower in the standings. The loss was more concerning because Edmonton had home ice advantage and was expected to control the series from the start. Instead, they found themselves chasing again. The 2022 playoffs brought Edmonton's most painful Game 1 loss yet. They faced Los Angeles, a team they had dominated during the regular season. Edmonton had won 3 of 4 games against the Kings and entered the playoffs as heavy favorites. Yet they lost Game 1 by a score of 4-3 in overtime, failing to close out a game. They had led 3-1 in the third period. The collapse collapse was complete when Adrian Kemp scored the winner with just over 2 minutes left in the extra period. Edmonton's 2023 playoff run started exactly the same way. Once again facing Los Angeles in the first round, the Oilers dropped Game 1 by a score of 4-1. This loss was particularly frustrating because Edmonton had made significant improvements to their roster during the season. They had added depth scoring and defensive help, yet the same problem showed up when the games mattered most. The Kings controlled play for most of the night while Edmonton Stars struggled to find their rhythm. The 2024 playoffs turned Edmonton's Game 1 problem into a full-blown crisis. They lost Game 1 3 separate times during their run to the Stanley Cup Final. First came a 7-4 defeat to Los Angeles, in which Edmonton's defense completely broke down. Then they lost 4-3 to Vancouver in a series that was supposed to showcase their growth as a playoff team. Finally, they dropped Game 1 to Dallas in the Western Conference Final, falling 3-2 despite outshooting the Stars 37-23. The most heartbreaking Game 1 loss came in the 2024 Stanley Cup Final against Florida. Edmonton fell 3-0 in a game where they managed just 18 shots on goal. The Panthers controlled every aspect of the game, from puck possession to special teams to goaltending. It was a kind of complete defeat that made fans question whether their team belonged on hockey's biggest stage. Each loss followed a similar pattern that made the streak even more maddening. Edmonton would start slowly, fall behind early, and spend the rest of the game trying to catch up. They would generate chances and create momentum, but always seemed to be one step behind. The psychological impact of constantly playing from behind became as big a factor as any tactical mistake. The numbers revealed just how damaging this streak became for Edmonton's playoff chances. In the NHL, teams that win Game 1 of a 7-game series go on to win that series approximately 60% of the time. For Edmonton, starting every series down 1-0 meant they had to win 4 games before their opponent could win 3 more. It left no room for error and put enormous pressure on every subsequent game. Edmonton's ability to recover from these Game 1 losses varied from series to series. They managed to beat Los Angeles in both 2022 and 2023 despite the poor starts. They overcame deficits against Vancouver and Dallas in 2024 to reach the Stanley Cup Final. But even when they won these series, the Game 1 losses made every step harder than it needed to be. They were constantly using energy to dig out of holes that could have been avoided with better starts. The streak also created a psychological burden that extended beyond the players to the entire fan base. Edmonton supporters began to expect Game 1 losses before each series even started. Social media was filled with jokes and memes about the team's inability to win opening games. Local sports radio spent hours debating the reasons behind the problem. What should have been exciting playoff atmosphere was replaced by nervous energy, and the familiar feeling of dread that came with knowing history was likely to repeat itself. The real reasons, psychology, and patterns. Understanding why Edmonton could not win Game 1s requires looking beyond simple bad luck or coincidence. 7 consecutive defeats across multiple seasons and different opponents suggest deeper issues with how the team prepared for and approached these crucial opening games. The problems fell into 3 main categories that fed off each other to create a cycle of failure. The first and perhaps most significant factor was the enormous pressure that came with being Edmonton's first legitimate Stanley Cup contender in decades. The city had not won a championship since 1990, creating massive expectations every time the playoffs arrived. Fans who had waited over 30 years for another cup run were not interested in moral victories or moral defeats. They wanted results immediately, and Game 1 represented the first test of whether this group could deliver. Connor McDavid's presence made the pressure even more intense. As a consensus best player in hockey, McDavid carried the weight of an entire franchise and fan base on his shoulders. Every playoff series began with questions about whether he could finally lead Edmonton to the promised land. The media attention surrounding McDavid and the Oilers turned each Game 1 into a referendum on his legacy and the team's championship credentials. This kind of scrutiny can be overwhelming even for elite athletes. The pressure was magnified by Edmonton's home ice advantage in many of these Game 1 situations. Rogers Place would be packed with 18,000 fans who had waited all season for playoff hockey to return. The building would be electric during warm-ups, with expectations at their highest point. But this energy could become a burden rather than an advantage when players felt they had to be perfect from the opening face-off. The crowd's enthusiasm sometimes translated into individual players trying to do too much too early. The second major factor was tactical over-preparation that led to rigid, predictable play. Edmonton's coaching staff would spend days analyzing their opponents and developing detailed game plans for Game 1. While preparation is normally a good thing, the Oilers seemed to become too focused on avoiding mistakes rather than playing their natural game. They would start games looking tentative and mechanical instead of loose and creative. This overthinking was most obvious in how Edmonton deployed their top players. McDavid and Leon Draisaitl are at their best when they can read and react to situations as they develop. But in Game 1s, they often looked like they were following a script rather than playing instinctively. Their line combinations would be shuffled frequently as coaches tried to find matchups that worked on paper. The constant adjustment prevented the team from finding any rhythm or momentum. Edmonton's special teams also suffered from over-preparation. Their power play, normally one of the most dangerous in the NHL, would look hesitant and overthought in Game 1 situations. Instead of moving the puck quickly and creating chaos, they would try to execute specific plays that opposing penalty kill units could easily read and defend. The same problem affected their penalty kill, which would focus so much on system play that they forgot to be aggressive and disruptive. The third factor was the mental weight of the streak itself as it grew longer each year. After the first few Game 1 losses, players began to feel the pressure of history repeating itself. They would enter each opening game knowing that fans and media were watching specifically to see if they could break the pattern. This awareness created tension that affected their performance in subtle but important ways. Veteran players tried to address the elephant in the room through team meetings and individual conversations. Players like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins would remind teammates that past results had no bearing on current games. But even these well-intentioned efforts sometimes backfire by drawing more attention to the problem they were trying to solve. The Game 1 curse became a self-fulfilling prophecy where the fear of losing actually contributed to the losses themselves. Goaltending played a significant role in several of Edmonton's Game 1 defeats. Stuart Skinner, who became the team's #1 goalie, showed a clear pattern of struggling in opening games compared to his performance later in series. His save percentage in Game 1s was consistently lower than his overall playoff numbers. Whether this was due to nerves, lack of game rhythm, or simple coincidence, it became another factor that opponents could exploit. The combination of these psychological and tactical factors created a perfect storm that Edmonton could not escape for 7 straight series. Each loss reinforced the negative patterns while making the next Game 1 even more difficult to win. Players would enter opening games already thinking about what went wrong previously instead of focusing entirely on the task at hand. Coaches would make adjustments based on past failures rather than trusting the systems that had worked during the regular season. What made Edmonton's Game 1 problem so frustrating was that it only seemed to affect opening games. Once they got past the initial defeat, the team would often play some of their best hockey of the series. They showed remarkable resilience in bouncing back from early deficits to win multiple series despite the poor starts. This pattern proved that Edmonton had the talent and mental toughness to succeed in playoff hockey, but something specific about Game 1 situations brought out their worst tendencies. The breakthrough analysis. The 2025 playoffs represented a turning point in how Edmonton approached their Game 1 problem, even though the solution did not come immediately. Throughout their playoff run, subtle changes in preparation and mindset began to show that the team was learning from years of opening game failures. The breakthrough that finally came in the Stanley Cup Final was the result of gradual improvements that built up over the course of the entire postseason. Edmonton's first-round series against Los Angeles showed early signs that something was different about this team's approach to pressure situations. They still lost Game 1 by a score of 3-1, extending their streak to 8 consecutive defeats. But the loss felt different from previous years. Players were more composed in post-game interviews, avoiding the frustrated body language that had become common after Game 1 defeats. Coach Chris Knobloch focused on specific tactical adjustments rather than making broad statements about effort or character. The team's response to that Game 1 loss was immediate and decisive. They won Game 2 in dominant fashion, scoring 6 goals and controlling play from start to finish. More importantly, they maintained that level of play throughout the series, winning in 5 games without the usual struggles that came from constantly playing catch-up hockey. The Kings series proved that Edmonton could recover quickly from Game 1 setbacks, but also showed they were developing better ways to handle the pressure. Edmonton's second-round series against Vegas followed a similar pattern. They lost Game 1 by a score of 4-2, but again the loss felt different from previous years. The team did not panic or make wholesale changes to their lineup. They stuck with their systems and trusted their preparation. The result was another quick recovery, winning Game 2 and eventually taking the series in 6 games. Each successful comeback built confidence that the Game 1 curse was not permanent. The Western Conference Final against Dallas provided the most important test of Edmonton's mental growth. They lost Game 1 by a score of 2-1 in a close game that could have gone either way. But instead of dwelling on another opening game defeat, the Oilers responded with their best stretch of hockey all season. They won the next 3 games to take control of the series and advanced to the Stanley Cup Final with a dominant 5-1 victory in Game 6. By the time the Stanley Cup Final arrived, Edmonton had shown they could overcome Game 1 losses consistently, but they had not yet proven they could avoid the problem entirely. The final against Florida represented their biggest test yet, both because of the stage and because of their history against the Panthers. Edmonton had lost to Florida in the 2024 Stanley Cup Final, with Game 1 being perhaps their worst performance of that entire series. The preparation for Game 1 of the 2025 Final was notably different from previous years. Coach Knobloch and his staff made a conscious decision to simplify their approach rather than overload players with information. Practice sessions were shorter and more focused on execution rather than extensive video review. The coaching staff trusted that their players knew how to play hockey and did not need to be reminded of every possible scenario. Individual players also approached Game 1 differently than in previous years. McDavid spoke openly about learning to manage his expectations and focusing on the process rather than results. Draisaitl emphasized the importance of treating Game 1 like any other game, despite the obvious significance of the moment. The veteran leadership group, including Nugent Hopkins and Zach Hyman, worked to create a relaxed atmosphere that allowed younger players to perform without feeling overwhelmed. The game itself unfolded in a way that tested every lesson Edmonton had learned about handling pressure. Florida took an early 1-0 lead, exactly the kind of start that had derailed previous Game 1 efforts. But instead of pressing for an immediate response, the Oilers stayed patient and waited for their opportunities. When those chances came, they capitalized with goals from McDavid and Draisaitl to take a 2-1 lead. Florida fought back to tie the game 2-2, then took a 3-2 lead in the third period. In previous years, this kind of deficit might have caused Edmonton to abandon their game plan and start chasing goals desperately. Instead, they continued to play structure hockey and trust their systems. Draisaitl scored his second goal of the game to tie it 3-3 and force overtime, showing the mental toughness that had been missing in previous Game 1 situations. The overtime period became a test of everything Edmonton had learned about handling pressure over the previous 5 years. They had multiple opportunities to win the game, but did not force bad shots or make desperate plays. When Draisaitl's winning goal finally came at 6:30 of overtime, it was a result of patient play and good positioning rather than individual heroics. The goal celebration was explosive, but it was also the release of years of built-up frustration and doubt. What made this Game 1 victory so significant was not just that it broke the streak, but how it was accomplished. Edmonton won by playing their game rather than trying to be something they were not. They handled adversity calmly and made smart decisions under pressure. Most importantly, they proved to themselves that they could rise to the occasion when it mattered most. The victory was validation that all the lessons learned from previous failures had finally paid off. The bigger picture. Edmonton's Game 1 breakthrough represents more than just the end of an unfortunate statistical streak. The victory signals a fundamental transformation in how this franchise approaches pressure situations and big moments. For a team that had been defined by its inability to start series properly, winning Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final represents the kind of mental breakthrough that can change everything about an organization's identity. The significance of this moment extends far beyond hockey statistics. Edmonton as a city had invested decades of emotional energy into this team's pursuit of another Stanley Cup championship. The 1990 victory came when many current fans were children or not yet born. An entire generation of supporters had grown up watching Edmonton come close but never quite reach the summit. The Game 1 curse had become a symbol of all the near misses and heartbreaks that defined the post-dynasty era. Breaking the streak in the Stanley Cup Final carries special weight because of where it happened and when it occurred. This was not a Game 1 victory in the first round against a lower seed or even in the conference finals against a familiar opponent. This was Game 1 of the Stanley Cup Final, the biggest stage in hockey, against a Florida team that had already beaten Edmonton in the previous year's final. The circumstances could not have been more challenging or more meaningful. The victory also represents the maturation of Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl as playoff performers. Both players entered the NHL with enormous expectations and the pressure of carrying a franchise back to championship contention. Early in their careers, that pressure sometimes seemed to weigh them down in crucial moments. The Game 1 streak became part of a larger narrative about whether Edmonton Stars could perform when it mattered most. McDavid's evolution as a playoff leader has been gradual but unmistakable. In early playoff appearances, he sometimes tried to do too much individually when games got tight. He would force plays that were not there or take on extra responsibilities that took him away from his natural strengths. The 2025 playoffs showed a more mature McDavid who trusted his teammates and played within the team concept even in pressure situations. Draisaitl's development has been equally impressive, particularly his ability to rise to the occasion in crucial games. His two-goal performance in Game 1 of the final, capped by the overtime winner, represents a kind of clutch performance that defines careers. Throughout the Game 1 streak, Draisaitl had often been Edmonton's best player in opening games even when the team lost. His ability to finally get the victory he deserved speaks to both individual growth and improved team support. The organizational changes that contributed to breaking the Game 1 curse reflect broader improvements throughout the Edmonton franchise. General manager Ken Holland assembled a deeper, more balanced roster that could handle playoff pressure better than previous versions of the team. The addition of veteran players like Zach Hyman and Matthias Ekholm provided leadership and experience that helped younger players navigate difficult moments. Coach Chris Knobloch's approach to managing pressure situations proved crucial in a breakthrough. Unlike some previous coaches who seemed to overthink big games, Knobloch maintained consistency in his systems and messaging. He trusted his players to execute rather than making constant adjustments based on the situation. This stability allowed the team to play with confidence rather than second-guessing themselves. The mental health and sports psychology aspects of overcoming the Game 1 curse should not be underestimated. Professional athletes are trained to handle pressure, but the psychological weight of repeated failures in similar situations can be overwhelming. Edmonton's ability to break through suggests they found effective ways to manage the mental side of their game, whether through individual work with sports psychologists or team-based approaches to handling adversity. From a historical perspective, Edmonton's Game 1 breakthrough fits into a larger pattern of successful teams overcoming mental barriers. The Boston Red Sox breaking the curse of the Bambino, the Chicago Cubs ending their championship drought, and countless other examples in sports history show that psychological barriers can be overcome with the right combination of talent, preparation, and mental fortitude. The comparison to Edmonton's dynasty years of the 1980s is particularly relevant. That team never had trouble winning Game 1s because they played with supreme confidence and expected to win every time they took the ice. The current group has now shown they can recapture that kind of mental approach, at least in the most important moments. The question moving forward is whether they can maintain that confidence consistently. The impact of breaking the Game 1 curse extends beyond this specific series or even this season. Future Edmonton teams will benefit from knowing that this barrier has been overcome. Young players entering the organization will not inherit the psychological baggage that had built up over 7 years of Game 1 failures. The franchise has proven to itself and its fans that it can rise to the occasion when everything is on the line. For Edmonton fans, the Game 1 victory provides validation for decades of loyalty and support. The supporters who packed Rogers Place for every home playoff game, who traveled to away games, and who never stopped believing despite repeated disappointments, finally got to experience the joy of seeing their team break through a major barrier. The celebration after Draisaitl's overtime goal was not just about one game, but about the vindication of faith that had been tested many times over the years. The curse is dead. The immediate aftermath of Leon Draisaitl's overtime goal told the story of what this Game 1 victory meant better than any statistics ever could. The explosion of sound from Rogers Place was unlike anything heard during Edmonton's previous playoff runs. Fans who had endured 7 consecutive Game 1 defeats finally had their moment of pure joy. Grown men cried openly in the stands. Strangers hugged each other as if they were family members. The release of emotion was visible throughout the entire building. The players' reaction on the ice was equally telling. Instead of the measured celebration that typically follows a Game 1 victory, Edmonton's response looked more like they had just won the Stanley Cup itself. Players piled on top of each other in front of the Florida net, while others skated around with their arms raised toward a crowd. The celebration lasted several minutes as teammates took turns embracing Draisaitl, the man who had finally broken the curse that had haunted him for so long. Social media erupted immediately after the goal as Edmonton fans around the world shared their disbelief and excitement. The hashtag Game 1 Finally began trending within minutes of the victory. Fans posted videos of their reactions from watch parties, bars, and living rooms across Alberta and beyond. Many of the posts included references to the 7 previous Game 1 losses and the relief that came with finally getting over that hurdle. The online celebration continued for hours after the game ended. Local bars and restaurants throughout Edmonton reported scenes of absolute chaos following Draisaitl's goal. The White Avenue Entertainment District, always a hub for Oilers celebrations, saw thousands of fans pour into the streets to celebrate together. Police reported no major incidents despite the massive crowds, as the mood was entirely positive and focused on shared joy rather than any destructive behavior. The city had waited 35 years for another Stanley Cup run, and breaking the Game 1 curse felt like a major step toward that ultimate goal. The victory's impact on the remainder of the series cannot be overstated. Game 1 wins provide teams with home ice advantage throughout a series, but more importantly, they establish psychological momentum that can carry through multiple games. For Edmonton, winning Game 1 meant they no longer had to play perfect hockey in every subsequent game. They could afford to have an off night or make mistakes without facing elimination pressure immediately. The psychological advantage extended beyond just game strategy to the overall mindset of both teams. Florida had beaten Edmonton in Game 1 of the previous year's final and likely expected history to repeat itself. When that did not happen, the Panthers had to adjust their expectations and approach. Meanwhile, Edmonton gained confidence that they belonged on this stage and could compete with anyone when playing their best hockey. Individual players spoke openly about what breaking the Game 1 curse meant to them personally. McDavid described the victory as lifting a weight off our shoulders that we didn't even realize was there. Draisaitl, who scored a winning goal, said it felt like finally proving to ourselves that we can come through in the biggest moments. The veteran players who have been part of multiple Game 1 losses expressed relief that the narrative around their team could finally change. Coach Chris Knobloch's post-game comments reflected the significance of the moment while trying to keep his team focused on a larger goal. He acknowledged that breaking the streak was important for team confidence, but emphasized that one game does not win a championship. His balanced approach helped maintain perspective while still allowing players and fans to enjoy a breakthrough moment that had been years in the making. The victory also shifted media coverage of the series and Edmonton's championship chances. For years, the Game 1 curse had been a standard talking point whenever Edmonton entered the playoffs. Sports analysts would inevitably mention the streak and speculate about whether this would be the year it finally ended. With that storyline resolved, coverage could focus on Edmonton's actual strengths and weaknesses rather than psychological barriers from previous seasons. Looking ahead to the remainder of the Stanley Cup Final, Edmonton's Game 1 victory fundamentally changed the dynamics of the series. They now held home ice advantage and had proven they could perform under the ultimate pressure. The question was no longer whether they could rise to the occasion in big moments, but whether they could sustain that level of performance over a full 7-game series against a determined Florida team. The broader implications for Edmonton's championship aspirations became clear in the days following Game 1. Breaking the curse removed one of the last remaining doubts about this group's ability to win when it mattered most. They had assembled the talent, developed the depth, and now proven the mental toughness necessary to compete for Stanley Cups. The Game 1 victory was not just about winning one game, but about establishing the credibility needed to be considered legitimate championship contenders. For a franchise and fan base that had endured decades of disappointment, the Game 1 breakthrough represented hope that this time might truly be different. The curse that had defined Edmonton's recent playoff history was officially dead. The question now was not whether they could win when it mattered, but how far this newfound confidence and proven ability to overcome pressure could carry them toward the ultimate prize they had been chasing for 35 years.